it's an important thing to start when you're small, or just even the first generation, is that whole advisory board, board of directors, because that board will become more important to you as you move into that second transfer. So maybe not as much, can certainly be helpful from original owner to siblings, but from siblings to cousins, let's say, then I think it's monumentally important.
Hey, and welcome back to Builder Funnel Radio. This is Building a Family Business, and as always, joined by my Uncle Brooks and Dad Wes. Welcome, guys.
Hey, welcome.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, so today we kind of wanted to just dive right in instead of kind of pulling some of the newsreel. I'm sure you guys are getting enough of that as we approach, I guess we're recording this, approaching the election cycle. So we're going to take this one in another path. Brooks, you were kind of diving into an article on kind of foundational pieces of a building, I guess, business or family business, not really specific to building. But do you want to kind of give a little context there?
Yeah, you bet. So I follow the Family Business Consulting Group, and they've been around for a little over 25 years. So I've been following them since they started, being that we're in a family business. And they have great articles and great webinars, and you have a lot of great content. And it's the kind of thing, I think they do a great job. And if it's your business of a size you can afford to work with them, I think they're a great company. But they have an article in their newsletter, the Family Business Advisor, called "The 5 Fundamental Building Blocks of a Strong Family Business." And it's just, you just get back to the basics of how you have, or what you have to do to build a family business, beyond whatever business you're in. So this can go, you can be in construction, you can be in remodeling, whatever space you're in. If you're trying to build a family business, the 5 fundamental building blocks are just key. So I just thought it's a good reminder, because wherever you are in your business development with your family, you can go back to this and go, oh yeah, we missed that. We should be doing that.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times when you bring up fundamentals, people are like, oh, I may be past the fundamentals, but you think about athletes and, people in sports environment, like they're always working on the fundamentals, and they all have coaches. And, so yeah, I think this is a good topic to dive into. And, Wes, the first, I think one of these fundamentals was having aligned owners. I guess let's kind of open up that topic for you guys. What do you think you guys have seen, that either has worked really well or hasn't worked when you've either had owner alignment and have not had owner alignment?
Well, I think let's maybe just take a step back and say, what is owner alignment, right? What do they mean by that in this article? And I mean, it's fairly self-explanatory. It's just that everyone in the family that has some ownership stake in that business, or who will have an ownership stake, let's say, but maybe doesn't have it yet, they have to be aligned around goals. So what's our purpose? Do we all agree on our purpose? Why are we in business together? What are we trying to accomplish? Because that could vary pretty widely, not just from generation to generation, but within a generation. So if there's, like in our family, we have five siblings, right? So all of us could have a very different opinion as to what our purpose is. So
I'd like to just point out that my opinions are right. I mean, I just like
sure.
Put that out there.
Yeah. So anyway, this podcast is over. So,
here, let me hit the clapper here. We'll edit that out.
Yank the cord on this one. So so you have to be aligned for purpose, and then so why are we in business together, and then what are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish? So, let's just take an example. Someone might be saying, hey, man, I want to build a lot of apartments, or someone else. Like in our family, we have, senior housing, and we have some apartments, and, but which direction are we going? Which is most important? Do we all agree on that? Are we trying to get to a certain number of units? Are we trying to serve a particular population, a market segment? So I think that's pretty important. And in the article, they also talk about, and we've talked about this in the past, core values. So thinking about what your core values are we in agreement on our core values? So, and there's a number of other things, but I think when you don't have alignment around those issues, what happens is, there's only 24 hours in a day. And so and out of that 24 hours, you're going to hopefully spend 8 hours sleeping, unless you don't sleep well at night, which we're just discussing before the podcast. But certainly the hours that you spend at work, if you burn up 30% of your time at work, with what I call frictional items, which would be things that are really, you're just talking to your other family members or other people, owners in the business about, you're just having this conflict over what you're doing because you are not in alignment. And you may not even be aware you're not in alignment around some of these key items because maybe you've never discussed them. Maybe you've just assumed that you're all in alignment, that you all think the same way. And so you can burn a lot of time on that, which is just time not spent on the business, which just means your business doesn't do as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good point because, Wes, along with the goals, the purpose, the goals, the core values, and they had the code of conduct in there. They had accountability and metrics, which are always, two important things. And, to go back to this question of alignment is that if you don't discuss alignment, you're most likely not aligned.
Right.
And I mean, in our business with, partners with my brother, Todd, and his wife, we had a steering meeting every week. That's how intensely we had to stay aligned, because the construction business is challenging, a lot of stuff. And so we would have, weekly steering meetings, monthly steering meetings, quarterly, and it was making sure we were all headed the same direction because things change, as people get, as we got older, it was like, well, what do we want to be doing with the business and things like that. So that question of alignment is, that's the first thing they talk about in this article is aligned owners.
And I like that point about meeting frequently because, you guys, so you and Todd, same age bracket, right? But if you go generationally, if you go, you've got an older generation involved in the business and you've got a younger generation. That's, I think, where you really start to see these big splits happen. Yeah. And they happen, but they don't necessarily happen right at the beginning. So let's say the founder of the company is in their 40s, right? So still hitting it really hard. And then they bring in a couple of kids, a kid or two or three, or however many will come into business, and they come in their early 20s.
Bring them all.
Yeah,
bring them
right.
all. Yeah.
Bring them on. So now we've got these two generations. Well, the difference between 22 and 23 and 43 or 45 is probably not that much in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. Everyone's still probably trying to make it. You haven't built up enough assets or whatever it happens to be. So you're kind of in natural alignment there. And the new generation coming in doesn't know anything, right? So they're busy learning and they're, sucking up all this information from the founder. But you go forward, say 15 or 20 years, and everything has changed because now you have a younger generation that's say in their late 30s or late 40s. And then you have the founding generation that's in their 60s. And man, and we've certainly seen this in our family, your goals, what you're your purpose, well, really probably more around your goal than your purpose.
Probably I'd take goal and I'd add risk tolerance because I think that really.
Right. And I think that's a big part of that of what your goals are, because your goal may be, well, I want to maintain. So, and that's just a natural thing that happens. You get in your 60s and 70s, you're going, well, I need to maintain. I've become less risk tolerant. Whereas now the person that, the second generation in their 40s, they're going, and now we're just hitting our stride. So they're like,
I got another 20 years.
On the afterburners, and here we go. And all of a sudden, if it's a common capital pool, it's all one business and everything, then all of a sudden you have some really either major discussions and you work it out and you figure out how to do it, or lots of times that's when things blow apart.
Yeah, I think the article said that, was it like 65%?
65%, yeah.
from one generation to the next, or siblings to cousins, or some, it was like
Right.
they fail, and probably that's a big part of it. Would you guys agree?
I would put that totally at that. Yeah,
Yeah.
because most likely the businesses are okay and they'll make money, but it's just they just come apart over lack of alignment, lack of common purpose. Why are we in this business? And if they make it to the third generation, Spencer, like makes to your generation, you don't have that commonality of you all raised in the same house, and you're going to have, in your case, you got 13 cousins. It's like, okay, what's the commonality of purpose? Why are we
pretty
why
tough.
are we in business together besides the fact that, we just ended up with these assets? And, so it takes leadership,
Yeah, it really does. And I think that article went on to say 65% fail between, once you go founder to siblings, siblings to cousins, 65% fail. And then they said out of all those failures, at least 60% or more were due to this interfamily conflict and family dynamics. And right.
So Brooks, you mentioned those, weekly steering meetings, and, Wes pointed out that you guys are in the same generation and age bracket. I guess I'm curious, what were the kinds of directional things that you guys were having to sort out? You said, things would change and suddenly, maybe you were aligned, but then something changes for one family or one person. They're like, oh, we want to do X, I guess I'm curious, were there any moments that you can think of, and just kind of how you guys navigated that?
I think probably the biggest one we had to navigate was just the, when we wanted to operate, wrap up operations, because it had to do with what did people want to be spending their time doing. So, everything's owned jointly. And if you have, partners, probably two different things. One big thing for us was around risk. And so, I'm not risk adverse, and other partners are risk adverse. So it was a balance of what risk we would take, and so we had to stay in alignment on that, because I was on the acquisition side of buying land, and so I would probably buy way more land than other people would be comfortable with. So we set up a process for staying in alignment by going through all of our acquisitions, and we had to buy off on it as a team, as an ownership team. So that's how we were able to deal with, one of those things where I could have gotten, way out over my skis and, oh yeah, look, I bought us 500 lots. And, we're like, well, yeah, we only produce 25 lots a year. So what was that about?
Yeah, but I got a great deal.
I got a great deal. It'll vary us, but I got a great deal. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I guess that would be around kind of ongoing.
Yeah. So what I really like about that is, where the communication is good between owners, then really that does provide that balance that's going to help the company survive. Because, we hear about companies where the founder starts it, risk taker, and the thing goes to the moon and it's fantastic and a huge success. But what we don't hear about is the other 99 companies out of 100 that are littered along the side of the road that didn't make it. And so I think that is where being able to incorporate everybody's input, if you know how to do it properly, and you're willing to do it and willing to be humble, and everyone is willing to be humble and take everyone else's input, they'll help your company survive and thrive and get through some tough times.
So how do you think, I know, we just went over the, first gen to kids, and then kids to cousins, and that high failure rate. What do you think it really takes in that second to third generation? You mentioned leadership, was there anything else from this article that you pulled that would maybe help somebody navigate, hey, if we're looking to keep passing this down, it kind of gets more fragmented, is kind of how I'm understanding you guys in terms of purpose and connection to the original founder, or purpose of the company. So Wes, any thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things they talked about in the article, and I think it's an important thing to start when you're small, or just even the first generation, is that whole advisory board of directors, because that board will become more important to you as you move into that second, transfer. So maybe not as much, can certainly be helpful from original owner to siblings, but from siblings to cousins, let's say, then I think it's monumentally important because probably most of the cousins are not that involved with the business. They may have an interest in it in terms of a monetary interest or maybe some stock or something else. But that board is what's going to keep the purpose and the goals and the core values and everything kind of in a central repository. So maybe it has a couple of 3 family members on it, some outside members and experts on the board as well. And then it's really the board's job to carry that from generation to generation to generation. And then people can choose to participate or not participate in the family business as it goes down the line. I don't know. What do you think, Brooks?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think I would take it back a step, Spence, and say, well, does the founder, and in talking to to our listeners, which is if you're a founder, you ask yourself, do you have the leadership capability and the emotional bandwidth and strength to be able to transition this business? And if you don't, sell it. Don't put everybody through all the brain damage. Don't do it. I think founders have to dig deep.
Yeah.
And say, hey, is this something I just wanted to do for me? And this kind of fulfilled my emotional and financial needs. And beyond that, I don't need to do anything else. Then sell it. If you have a longer term strategy, which is around family business, trying to pass this on, which is so much more extra work.
Yeah.
It's just so, it's much easier just to cash it out, put it in the bank, and you can pass that on to your kids as a stock account. That's way easier than trying to transition a family business. But if that's part of your goals is to transition a family business, then as a founder, have that depth and figure out, okay, how am I going to do this to kind of get it to that second generation and set up those pieces? Because the second generation can't do it if the founder isn't emotionally mature enough to move that along.
And isn't willing, can't let go. And that's probably one of the biggest problems that you do see in family businesses, is just usually it's the founder because they have the emotional energy around creating something. It's their creation, it's their baby. And if they can't let go, or if you're the founder, as Brooks was saying, if you can't see yourself letting go and doing something else, then it's best to just cash it out at some point and make that your goal.
Yeah.
Make your strategy around that and still, have good relations with your kids and all those other things. Because family business is a lot of work because it takes a ton of communication. There tends to be a lot more conflict, or can be a lot more conflict, because you're just working out all these different things that are combined with both business and family. 2 things that are both difficult, right?
Yeah,
so put both of them together, and then it's
kind of the 1 + 1 = 3.
Right. Yeah.
In not the great way. Yeah.
Not a great way. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I think, last week or the week prior, we kind of talked about just what does it take to sell your business. And so, if you are that founder, it seems like what you were saying, like really dig in and figure out which path you want to go. And if you're trying to sell it, then you're going to go down that path of like systematizing and doing those things and knowing that is a challenging path too in this industry, but it may be a lot more simplified than actually trying to transfer it down and set up those systems. But I guess if you are going to try to continue to do that, what else, did you guys dig out of the article that is really critical to be thinking about, Brooks?
Well, they talked about, alignment, getting everything in alignment first. They talked about, using an advisory board or fiduciary board as time went on. Then using that to work on your strategic planning, what's your strategy as a business. So you're using the input of those board members. And then they talked about merit-based leadership, which is, whoever's in leadership position may or may not be a family member, depending on, what the metrics are and if there's somebody capable or not. And that's part of the board's decision. Board's job is to find the right person to lead the company, whether they're a family member or not. Sometimes a family member might rise to the surface and be like, oh yeah, this is the right person for it. Or it could be like, yeah, no one's really, you've got the expertise or the knowledge or the interest. So that board has to find, they have a responsibility then to find that person, to run the business. So I think that's the other, strategic planning, finding the right person to run the business, key things.
Yeah. So with the board, you said they're supposed to find that person that can run the business, and that may either be family or non-family. I guess, are there other kind of key points that the board, like what should the board be holding the company accountable to? I guess, what are some high level points there, Wes, as you think about that board?
Once again, I think if the company does do strategic planning, then it's the board's job to make sure that the strategic plan is adhered to. So that, that's the key thing that, they're going, we need to make sure that the strategic plan is executed. And in the article, they really talk about, 4 different things that board would do. First, they need to represent the interests of the shareholders. So, and that certainly becomes more of an issue as ownership is not necessarily represented on the board in a major way, right? So sometimes businesses that become separated from their shareholders and they're more interested in lining the nest of the people that are operating the business versus making sure that the shareholders are represented. So, that's first and foremost, that they represent the shareholders, many of whom may just sit on the board, right, with a small company. But then they need to understand what the competitive advantages are for the company, why they're in business, what their edge is. And then they're going to work with management to set that strategy and that strategic plan. And then they're going to hold management accountable. So the board ideally should be able to hire and fire whoever is top management of the company. And it was just one person. So you could see where if you went down 3 generations, and let's say you had a cousin running the company, and it's, gotten to be a fairly sizable operation, what if that cousin isn't cutting it? He's a family member, or he or she is a family member. Well, the board's responsibility is to say, this person isn't cutting it, and we need to put somebody else in there, either a family member or a non-family member, whoever is the most qualified. And that's the job of the board, is to make sure that the company is properly run and provide that oversight function. Is that what you're driving at, Spence?
Yeah, for sure. Because I think that almost adds that layer that helps make a decision like that, where it's like, hey, the board has this interest in the company core values, the purpose, the mission. And then if you do have a family member that maybe isn't cutting it, they can kind of step in and go, hey, we need to make a change. And maybe that takes a little bit of the, personal nature, family nature out, although I'm sure there's still some. But if that's kind of how the system is set up, I guess that helps clarify that. And then I think it just, it makes me think about, gosh, if you do want it to keep going to family, to family, to family, you have to put a lot of work into developing those leaders, because the company in theory should be getting bigger and bigger and, prospering more and more. And that may not happen. That's not guaranteed. But if it does, then somebody's stepping into a very different operation than it was in the first 5 years or 10 years. So yeah, I guess, yes, it does answer my question. So I kind of want to bounce back to Brooks. You had mentioned strategic planning, and I know, Wes, you touched on it too, but what is strategic planning when you guys think about that? I feel like that's kind of one of those words that gets thrown out there a lot. And it just, I think there's a feeling that it's like, oh, well, it's long-term, it's vision, or there's kind of these other buzzwords that go along with it. But I guess, Brooks, how do you look at that term of strategic planning
here?
Well, yeah, I try to feed those your way.
I appreciate it.
Either the really long open-ended ones or
right.
the hyper specific, like this should be an easy question, but I'm making it seem like it's not. Yeah.
Well, strategic. they talk about it and they just talk about, they say in business, enterprises start with the belief that product or service be valuable. And then that, identifying the customer and then identifying what your strengths are. So I think it's going back to, whatever business you're in and saying, well, what's our value to what's our value to the customer? Who's the customer? And what's our strategy around meeting the needs of those customers? And picking just one or two or maybe three things and saying, okay, that's our strategy. Let's try to execute that strategy. Maybe they used an example of a restaurant business and their goal was to turn they felt they created a great experience for the customer, and they turned their tables quickly. And so that was their strategy. So that's what they executed on. So their whole strategy was around having a great restaurant experience, turning tables quickly. And that fostered everything they did about how their, experience was set up. And it stay with that and make a difference. It's like, oh, we're going to offer a lot of slow roasted pot roast. People will come in and, they'll order that and it'll take 2 days to make it, or you're going to have something that's quicker. So I think that's important. So your strategy as a construction business may be that our strategy is, hey, we provide great kitchens, quickly. And you just try to execute on that. Think how hard that would be just to execute and do that on a regular basis.
And Bergen, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head because, they say strategy is defined as a goal, and what is the plan to get to that goal. So you got to have both of those parts to have a strategy. So, you're talking about the quick bath. Well, that is definitely a strategy. Our path to maybe your goal is we want to penetrate, 40% of the bathroom remodeling market in our town. What's our strategy? Well, maybe your strategy is, hey, we can do bathrooms in 2 days, and that's our plan. That is how we are going to be unique, and that's how we'll get to our goal. Then you're right, that is your strategy. So you're just picking a path that you think is the best way to get to that goal. So you got to revisit it every so often to make sure that path is still working for you.
Yeah, so basically just kind of going back to the basics of here's the goal and how do we serve that customer, and is our product still viable, and is what we're doing actually different, and then okay, what are we going to do about that?
Yeah, right. You're back to your 3 unique things, for your proposition, all that kind of the marketing piece that fits into that. But that's the board's responsibility too, is to make sure that once that plan, the strategic plan has been established, that management is actually executing it properly and hitting all the marks on it.
So the other part of the article, kind of the tail end of it, talked about having a engaged family governance, which sounds really fancy, but I guess what is that, or what does that look like?
Yeah, good question. I think this is probably one of the more important parts of the article, because it really kind of gives you a roadmap forward for how you would start to put this in place if you're starting to think about these building blocks and think about your family business. And essentially it's saying, hey, you need to get together with, get 2 or 3 of your family members together that are involved in the business, and they have a specific duty to meet every so often on a regular schedule to work through a lot of the things that we've talked about on the podcast today. What is our purpose? What's our goal? What are our core values? What's our code of conduct? And kind of get all those things down on paper and make sure that there is agreement. And so they could do that. And everyone's busy, everybody's busy working. So they suggest taking a couple of years to do that, meeting every month or so to work on it, but then assigning off each one of these little chunks to one person in the family to lead that particular meeting and talk through that particular aspect. So one meeting might be on goals. What are we trying to accomplish? What's the best way to do that? And working through that discussion. Another one might be, well, what's our purpose? Why are we in business together? Do we want to build a bank of assets to help sustain the family? Are we in business because we want to, benefit the environment? There could be lots of different reasons, but you need to be in alignment on that. So anyway, but that core group can kind of walk its way through that and make sure everyone is together on that. And that can really become foundational too when working with your board later, when you put one together and going, hey, look at all this stuff. We've already worked out these things. This is what we're about. This is where we're going. This is how we're going to accomplish it. And then, after that, it's just kind of executing on that plan once you put it together, and revisiting it, which I think is the other key point. And Brooks probably agree with this, that you gotta look at your plan once it's done, and otherwise it's just a paperweight.
That is for sure.
Yeah. And a paperweight, for those of you who don't know, is something that's heavy that holds down paper on your desk, if you're totally digital at this point.
Hopefully we're
What is this
there.
paperweight you speak of?
Yeah. So Brooks, I guess in thinking about this family governance piece, or just maybe the whole article and some of the things we've talked about, why do you think that the Powell family business has been able to sustain over, I don't know, however many generations it is to this point?
It's a good question. And I think that's a question every company has to look at. And I would say, our company, like other companies, is always, at risk of not making that, transition. And again, goes back to leadership and willingness, because as you go back to the change in, people's risk profiles, without that transfer of ownership and transfer of equity and the transfer of risk, it's pretty hard to move the company forward, because for someone to lead, they have to have control. And we talked about having a board, and that board could change leadership if they didn't feel like someone was doing the right thing. But until that system kind of gets set up, very difficult, I think, for families to move forward. In our family businesses, my brother and I chose not to continue our family construction business. It really was a construction business that we owned, and we shut it down and had a bank of assets, which we now have our kids participating in. But that's different than an ongoing, everyday operational business. So we approached it a little bit differently, different than some of the other things we're doing within the family business. So I would say it's it's TBD, right, how that'll work.
Absolutely. Each generation. I think on one of our prior podcasts, Spence, we spent a lot of time talking about, well, it really came down to how do you transition from generation to generation. And if you're going to keep the company within the family, then each generation has to figure out a way to take enough of their chips off the table, so to speak, that they are comfortable, and that then their risk profile is respected. Because as you get older and as your risk profile goes down, less, more risk averse, you got to have enough money in the bank and resources and assets. You feel like, oh, I'm not going to run out of money, before I shuffle off this mortal coil. So, and that's super important, because, and you see that, everyone go, oh, as I get older, yeah, am I going to run out of money? Do I have enough money? And it's a big thing when you talk to seniors about that. They're going, man, I'm really concerned. Do I have enough money? And so each generation has to have enough money taken off of the table and out of the business that's not at risk within the business, that they're fine. And so if you don't have a mechanism for doing that, then what will happen is that the older generation's risk profile will start to squeeze down and impact the ability of the business to operate.
Absolutely. And if that older generation's risk profile, is not such that allows for growth, and they also, have a desire for more earnings versus, taper, so there's this combination of, if you're the founder and I want to have less risk, but I want to continue to earn more and more and more because I enjoyed that part of the business, probably not going to work,
Yeah.
Better to wrap it up.
Kind of interesting. I just read an article about Peloton, because Peloton's been very popular with the shutdown and everything. They've been doing well. But they had an interesting interview with the COO of Peloton. And the question was, well, gee, this last quarter, you showed a profit for the first time ever. Is that a problem? And I'm thinking, well, what a strange question, right? But then you think about it, and the answer was, well, the reason that question was asked is because they're a growing company.
Right.
And so they have to get to a particular size and magnitude in order to be successful and maintain their market position. So if they're not pushing hard enough and they're making money and they're not reinvesting everything into growth, then they're starting to shift into a different type of company. And I think that's a little bit what we're talking about on a much smaller scale for all of our companies, obviously,
Right.
but it's that whole idea of, are we taking cash out, or are we reinvesting cash and driving the business forward? And that really, a lot of that just depends on the risk profile and where you are in your life's journey.
Yeah, that's a big one. And Brooks, I appreciate the honesty of just the like TBD. It feels like though every family business at every generation, there's probably a high degree of risk backed by the stats from this article, where there's just so many different dynamics at play from, I mean, the one that you just mentioned, the risk tolerance, it feels like is just one of those huge ones that
I think the risk tolerance is huge, and the ability for people to, like Wes said, take their chips off the table.
Yeah.
And, because you see typically if someone's an entrepreneur, the way they do that is they say, well, I'll sell my business, I'll close it down, and that way I can capture what I've earned, and I know I can live off of that. But if as a founder, or you can't come to terms with that, or you're afraid you'll never make enough money, you'll never be able to make that transition. So I think that's where, if our listeners are founders of their businesses, really, dig deep and think about that. Think about, okay, well, what type of person am I? Would I be able to do this? You just don't want to stumble into trying to transition your business to your kids or relatives, because it's just too painful. It's just not worth it.
Yeah.
It's
Unless you just really, really want to, right? But know what you're getting into is
want to do it and want to complete it until the point where you find out, oh, it just isn't going to work because I don't have enough people, kids interested in it, or nephews and nieces interested in it, or the business isn't viable for other reasons, but go into it knowing that, this is probably going to be one of the harder things you'll ever do.
Yeah, you have to be honest about the amount of effort involved with it, and don't go into it with a kind of oh, this sounds great, hey, it'll be great. The kids or the cousins, they'll have the business, and well, it's easy, right? And it's not
a good
easy.
exit. Yeah, it's a great exit strategy for me. This really works out. It's probably the hardest exit strategy there is.
Right. Based on that, if it works, it can be great.
Fantastic. Absolutely.
It can be great, but it is a lot of work. So take that into consideration.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And it made me think, I'm reading this book called The Psychology of Money right now. And, are you reading it too, Wes? Or
I recommended it to you. So,
well, there you go. I guess I finally got around to it. I have a long list. So, well, thanks, Wes, for the recommendation.
Sure,
I'm finally reading your book. It's called The Psychology of Money. We'll link to it in the show notes. But there's a section in there that reminded me, I think it's connected to the risk profiles, and just as you move through the spectrum of life. But this kind of talked about, I think it was the part where it talks about, the accumulation of money and then the preserving or keeping of money. And you kind of have to take on risk to accumulate and push forward, but then you have to have a certain level of like paranoia basically to protect and keep it. And I think probably later in life that general, like where you balance, you just sit more on the paranoia side as a default,
Probably 110% on the paranoia side,
Yeah, all the way.
All the way. You have no recovery time. If you're 80.
And that's exactly right. Brooks hit the nail on the head there. It's no recovery time. And when you're 25 or 30, you got lots of recovery time. So what's the big deal? You can take a few swings at the fences and, and whiff a few balls, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But not at 75.
Fair enough. Yeah. And so maybe we'll have to dive into the psychology of money a little bit more. We'll have Brooks read it.
It's a really good book. It's a really good book.
Yeah, but I think it does help you understand why some of that, risk tolerance changes, and then why it leads to some of these challenges in transferring, because, it seems like what I'm hearing from you guys, like that founder really just needs to make the commitment to it and just do it and then phase out. And I know you guys have talked about like moving through the buyout process quickly and some of those things. And it all kind of, this helps kind of clarify the why behind it and why it's so challenging. And so I think going into it, if you know these things and you can take those right steps, you can put in the pieces and then, just say, hey, this was my baby, I created it, but now I'm getting out and I'll go do something else. And maybe you put that energy somewhere else, and if you can't do that, then don't even bother. So I guess, those are my final thoughts and takeaways, but Wes, any final thoughts and takeaways from kind of these 5 foundational pieces?
No, not really. I think we've beat the dead horse pretty well. But I would put in another plug. Maybe Brooks is already going to do this for the Family Business Consulting Group. Just seems like they have a lot of good content. So I'd probably hit their website and read their blog and stuff like that. You probably get a lot of great info that would be helpful to you.
Cool.
Yep,
How about you, Brooks?
Agree.
Right on. Yeah, we'll link them up in the show notes as well. And we'll put this article there if you guys want the kind of the context behind the discussion today. But other than that, I think we'll wrap. So thanks, Wes. Thanks, Brooks. And thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week here on Building a Family Business on Builder Funnel Radio.